5 occur in just 5 countries: India, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, and China. Yet even in the most destitute regions of this planet, there are those who have greater advantages than others. Nicholas Kristof, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and co-author of the book Half the Sky: From Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide, has called the discrimination against women and girls the biggest challenge of the 21st century. In a world where 1 billion people go hungry every day, Kristof notes that when a starving family has a choice of feeding an infant boy or an infant girl, the boy, far more often than not, gets fed. In the last 50 years, he says, more women and girls have died as a result of this kind of discrimination than all the men who died in the wars of the 20th century. As this symposium attests, our students and faculty at Middlebury are well attuned to these concerns and are actively seeking to better understand the causes of and solutions to these pressing problems. Just last week, several of us on campus heard from grant recipients, young social entrepreneurs who spent the summer in the field. They launched a skill development program for the deaf in Karachi in an effort to promote financial independence among those who previously had little prospect for employment. They conducted dance and writing workshops at a women's center for domestic abuse victims in Chicago. They opened a peace-building camp for high school and university students in Burundi, and they designed and built desks for a school in Swaziland. Other students have returned to campus after completing internships sponsored by the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty and the Gardens for Health International in the Gasabo district of Rwanda. Gardens for Health International is a partner of the Middlebury chapter of GlobeMed. Our global health minor continues to attract faculty from across disciplines: sociology, chemistry, economics, history, geography, offering students the breadth and depth of understanding that is necessary to appreciate the inherent complexity of this field. And since its founding in 2007, the Catherine Mosserman Davis Projects for Peace has funded Middlebury student initiatives in Nepal and Jordan, Morocco and Turkey, Israel and Guatemala, Thailand and Afghanistan, Pakistan and Rwanda, and right here in the United States. Many of these innovative projects have sought to address the very economic, social, and political challenges that bring us here today. Now, before I turn things over to Eric, I would like to thank the numerous sponsors of this symposium: the IP&E program, the Christian A. Johnson Economics Fund, the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs, the Academic Enrichment Fund, the Department of Political Science, the programs in African Studies, East Asian Studies, Latin American Studies, Middle East Studies, South Asian Studies, and Environmental Studies, the Franklin Environmental Center at Hillcrest, Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, the Middlebury Center for Social Entrepreneurship, the Global Health Minor, and Atwater, Brainerd, and Cook Commons. As this lengthy and impressive list suggests, this community cares deeply about the issues we will discuss today. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and for contributing to such a thoughtful and important program. And it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Eric Bleich. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Good afternoon. I'm Eric Bleich. I'm the director of the program in International Politics and Economics. I'm very happy to welcome you as well to this annual International Politics and Economics Symposium. And as you probably deduced, our goal in the IP&E program in creating this forum, this annual forum, is to highlight some of the most important issues that the global community faces in our contemporary world. And as Ron has noted, we have an excellent topic for this year and excellent speakers here today. And for this, we're indebted not only to the generous funding of our supporters, which Ron listed and noted appropriately. We're also indebted to the hard work of the Symposium Committee. The Symposium Committee consisted this year of Professors John Isham and John Malucci of the Economics Department, and Professors Nadia Horning and Kemi Fuentes-George of the Political Science Department, as well as Professor Sujata Murthy of the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program. These are the team, that's the team, the 5 of them who selected the topic and recruited the speakers, and along with our student chairs and Professor Eric Gong of the Economics Department, they're going to help guide us through the intellectually exciting parts of the day. There are other aspects of the symposium for which we should also give thanks. Some people will find these exciting too. I know I do. Most importantly, Martha Baldwin and Charlotte Tate, if you could raise your hands. They are the heart of the administrative organizing that takes place here. And I'd also like to thank facilities services, dining services, the common staff, college communications, and library and information services for their contributions, each of which was central to making this happen today. In particular, it's worth noting that this event is being recorded for posterity, as well as live streamed around the world for those who aren't able to be here today. That's the broader Middlebury and Monterey community, as well as others. So that's some excitement for you. So before I turn the program over to Faize to get things started, I want to ask you to please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that already. And let me point out in my capacity as crowd control manager that there are 3 exits to the room you sit in now. One is the way that most of you came in, another is over there, and a third is around behind the seats. Okay, finally I'm going to note a couple of things that probably haven't failed to escape you. One is that we are a big crowd, so getting people in and out on time for the short coffee breaks is going to be important. So I've asked our student chair and faculty moderators of each panels to be as precise as they can in ending the panel that they're leading. Now this panel's starting a little late, so you might take a little bit of leeway there, but not too much, because we want to make sure that things go on time. And also remember, we have an evening session tonight from 7:15 to 8:30 in the conference room of the Robert A. Jones House upstairs. That's a really nice component of the symposium because it allows our 3 speakers to sit down together and really talk to each other about the things that they have learned from each other and ways forward that they might consider now that they've heard each other out. So with that in mind, let me re-extend my warm welcome to you and to our speakers. Let the symposium begin. Faize.
Hi, my name is Faiza Haji Hassan, and I'm a senior here at Middlebury College. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Valentine Moghadam, who is currently the Director of International Affairs Program at Northeastern University and also a professor of sociology. Dr. Moghadam received her MA and PhD in sociology from the American University in DC. Her scholarship addresses urgent contemporary issues such as globalization, social movement, feminism, and the Middle East. She has authored numerous books, edited anthologies, and published extensively in scholarly journals. Within international and global studies, Dr. Moghadam's Globalizing Women is considered to be the most important work on transnational feminist concern. Globalizing Women received the Victoria Shark Award in 2006 as the best book on women in politics. Her writing on women in Middle East have tried to show the role of social forces other than religion, such as cultural, economic, and political forces in determining the situation of women in all these different Islamic countries and regions. Apart from her academic experiences, Dr. Moghadam worked in UNESCO in Paris as the chief of the Gender Equality and Development section. And also, prior to that, she was a research fellow at NU Wider in Helsinki. I also found it very interesting that Dr. Moghadam was a participant in the 4th World Conference in Women in Beijing. Just think about it, women for women, by women. And if I were to talk about Dr. Moghadam's academic and professional achievements, probably there would be no time for her to talk. Today, her talk is about globalization, women, work in the Middle East toward economic citizenship. So I'm going to stop here and ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Moghadam to our campus.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank Middlebury College for the kind invitation to this very important and interesting and topical symposium. What a wonderful topic, and what a wonderful learning experience for the students as well. So, without further ado, and especially I want to thank Dr. Bleich for the kind invitation and for organizing this important symposium. So let me begin with with the title of my presentation today, which is Globalization, Women and Work in the Middle East and North Africa Region Toward Economic Citizenship. Let me just preface this by saying that we heard a little bit about issues of poverty. And poverty is, of course, one of the major issues in the international community today. I suppose another one would be conflict and its prevention and resolution. And the Millennium Development Goals, of course, have been organized around the question of alleviating and eradicating poverty. My presentation today doesn't focus on poverty. The focus is really on another level. It is on social rights and economic citizenship, especially for women in the workforce. Social rights and economic citizenship are important in order to prevent households, families, individuals from falling into poverty. Or they are important for helping to relieve people who are in an impoverished state. So that is just by way of background about social rights and economic citizenship. And I'll talk a little bit more about these concepts in a moment. So what are the issues? The era of globalization, with its features of flexible labor markets, price and trade liberalization, outsourcing, and privatization, has increased pressures on working women throughout the world. And its attendant crises have exacerbated those pressures. At the same time, globalization has generated growing demands for social and economic rights, which constitute an essential element of the panoply of citizenship. In addition, international organizations, such as those promoting and monitoring the Millennium Development Goals, have determined that women's productive labor contributes to poverty alleviation or prevention, as well as to economic performance and economic growth. Similarly, feminists have argued that women's economic participation is a prerequisite for our participation in political society and for overall empowerment. At a time of transition and turmoil in, for example, the Middle East and North Africa, since at least the Arab Spring, with all manner of citizen demands there, including demands emanating from the women's rights movement, my talk today focuses on one aspect of those demands. It focuses on patterns of women's work, on those legal and policy frameworks that are either enabling or constraining in terms of women's work and women's economic citizenship, and pathways to rights and to citizenship. So let's begin by noting that the global economy shapes women's work opportunities and conditions, whether in the much vaunted knowledge economy, or in factory work, or in food production. While the effects of globalization are variable across economic sectors and segments of the working population, generally economists are agreed, and sociologists are agreed too, that employment conditions have deteriorated. The global economy also has affected patterns of labor mobility and migration, both of which are gendered and are constituted by women as well as men. Indeed, economic globalization, labor market flexibilization, and feminization, referring back to both the large numbers of women who are working, but also the deterioration of work conditions, that these three processes are linked. So naturally, gender matters in the global economy as it does in other domains. Men and women are differently situated in labor markets, especially in relation to, first, the means of production, in particular in terms of the ownership of the means of production, And also men and women are differently situated in relation to the sphere of reproduction, reproductive work, domestic work, household responsibilities, or what some people call the care economy. Class is also salient. Differentiation among women as among men means different positioning in labor markets and the extent of the double burden. Women across social classes have different relations to the means of production, to education, and to income. State policies can attenuate the pressures that working women face. Such policies include paid maternity leaves, quality and affordable child care, family or child allowances. The welfare state in particular helps to what we call decommodify labor by providing such social rights. In principle, a socialist economy or a social democratic state, as in the Nordic countries, approaches decommodification as an explicit goal. Hence, the expansion of social rights in those types of economies and societies. This is not necessarily the case in the more classic liberal capitalist or neoliberal economy. In the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, female labor in particular has yet to be commodified. That is, the female share of the paid labor force, especially in the private sector, is very low by international standards. So in other words, before we decommodify labor through the provision of social rights, we need to commodify labor, in particular in countries of the Middle East and North Africa, where relatively few women are actually in the labor force, but where that is actually one of their key demands. So let's look at some of the data here on women's labor force participation rates in global perspective, 1980 to 85, and 2005 to 2010. As you can see, the smallest and the lowest rates of female labor force participation are actually in the Middle East and North Africa, and that remains the case whether in the 1980s or in the new century. You can also see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, between the 1980s, between 1985 and 2010, there was quite a dramatic increase in women's labor force participation, but that really has not been the case in the Middle East and North Africa region, where the increase is really quite small. So that's in global perspective. And as you can see, very high rates of female labor force participation are found in East Asia and Pacific, and of course also in North America and Europe and Central America. So you can get a sense of the differences in female labor force participation. Now, female share of total labor force in the various Middle East and North African countries is then illustrated in this particular table, and I have data here for 1990 and 2010. As you can see, in most cases, the increase, again, has not been terribly significant. And in a few countries, in fact, there have been declines in 2010 relative to 1990. So there have been declines in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Syria, and in Turkey too, but Turkey is not included in that particular table. The two countries where female labor force participation and the female share of the total labor force, by the way, this is public and private sector both, generally tend to be highest consistently over the years are Tunisia and Morocco. So these labor force participation rates, I argue, have been a function of certain structural and institutional features that are not unique, but are distinctive in the Middle East and North Africa region. The oil economy has played a major role in suppressing the supply of female labor and also the demand for female labor. In what way? As I've been arguing since the early 1990s, the oil economy in the MENA region, or most places in the world actually, tends to be capital intensive, using relatively few workers, and the workers that it does employ tend to be men. So it's capital intensive and male intensive. At the same time, the oil economy, especially in countries of the Middle East and North Africa, has tended to increase the wages of male workers. This also attenuates the need for women in those households where men are working in the oil sector or related sectors to seek jobs. So the oil economy has played a role in suppressing the supply and demand for female labor. Family law in the Middle East and North Africa, African countries, has also been an institutional barrier to the expansion of female labor and to both the supply and demand for female labor. How does that work? Family law, in particular Muslim family law, as was the case in Christian family laws in the Christian-dominant countries in an earlier period in time, tends to codify traditional gender relations. That is, it codifies women as wives, daughters, and mothers, and men as maintainers of the household and the family and as the breadwinners. That's actually quite explicit in the family laws. So that tends also to attenuate the supply of women and also the demand for women. And the social norms tend to reflect both the institution of Muslim family law and the overall economic structure, both of which tend to suppress female labor supply and demand. So this is an argument that I have been making since the early 1990s. In addition to these structural and institutional and normative features that suppress female labor supply and demand, they have also worked to suppress or to reduce or to constrain women's social and economic rights. In addition, paid maternity leaves and child care facilities are not readily available in most countries, creating a disincentive for many women, especially women from lower income families, to join the labor force. I've been working on this topic for a very long time, and most of the women in the paid labor force in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa region are from the educated middle class. Working class women, women from low income families, are disproportionately absent from the paid labor force. And I believe that these are some of the main reasons why they are absent. There's the oil economy, of course. Today it's playing less of a role than it did in previous decades, but it still does play a role. Family law continues to play a very important role, which is why women's organizations in the region have been calling for the reform of family law, not only because of labor force issues, but other issues as well. And of course, the normative environment, which tends to reflect these structural and institutional features. So, having now discussed the issues, what are the goals? Well, quite succinctly, decent work, work-family balance, and recognition of care work, along with institutional supports for working women. What Gösta Esping-Andersson called decommodification, and what Marshall, T.H. Marshall, Alice Kessler Harris, and a slew of international agreements call the social rights of citizenship or economic citizenship. So, what do we mean by citizenship rights? And what did T.H. Marshall bequeath to us in our understanding of the rights of citizenship? Concepts of citizenship, the panoply of citizen rights as well as obligations of citizenship, have been defined by various scholars, most notably the British historian, sociologist T.H. Marshall. His conceptualization, while based on British history and later extended to Western countries generally, is also applicable to other regions of world society. In fact, the concept of citizenship rights, sometimes overlapping with human rights but with some notable distinctions, has become diffused globally. It's been advanced by activists, codified in international agreements, and it is inscribed in constitutions and in social policies. In terms of international standards and norms, social economic rights are found in the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, which was adopted by the world community in 1966. Before I go further, let me just point out that in this table, which I've adopted from T.H. Marshall's conceptualization of the rights of citizenship, I've delineated here civil rights, political rights, and social rights. T.H. Marshall very famously said that the 18th century was the century of civil rights, rights over the body, the right not to be tortured, etc., freedom of mobility, right? In that transition from feudalism to capitalism, workers could actually move around rather than be tied to one place. The 19th century was the century of political rights, various revolutions, various mass protests, and so on, the right to vote, suffrage, etc., although women had to wait until the next century, and so did African Americans in the United States. And the 20th century, he said, was a century of social rights, by which he meant the expansion of the welfare state, and in particular, rights, labor rights, and other types of rights won by labor movements. That kind of progression is, of course, certainly specific to England, and that was his case study, and others have expanded this to describe movements and the emergence of notions of rights of citizenship in Western Europe. In the developing world, the progression was somewhat different, and in some cases, all three rights have been called for, demanded, and won or contested over, first of all, in a less protracted period than was the case in what are today the core countries, and also, in some cases, actually simultaneously. Civil and social rights were distinguished by T.H. Marshall. But if you think about women in certain parts of the world, and in particular in the Middle East and North Africa, at least until relatively recently in some of the countries, one key civil right is the right of mobility, the right to move, the right to access space. That right has tended to be very, very important for commodification and for social rights. But that right has also been constrained by family law. That was a right that Western women also did not have in previous centuries. And today in Middle East and North African countries, in certain countries where family law has not yet been reformed, women need the permission of a male member of their family in order to, in some cases, open a bank account, in other cases, to get a job or to stay in the job, and so on and so forth, or to travel. So these are the civil right to contract, equal treatment under the law, freedom of expression, religion, privacy, control over one's body. This is a key civil right that feminists won, that women won, actually just in the 20th century. Choice of residence, choice of occupation. Political rights, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. The right to vote, nationality rights, refugee and contract worker rights. That's a contested and sensitive one in today's world. Minority rights, dissident rights. And then, of course, social rights, which constitute the topic of my talk today. Health services, family allowances, primary and secondary schooling, public, of course, higher education, vocational education, compensatory rights, social insurance, paid maternity leave, and subsidized quality child care. Okay? This is the panoply of the rights of citizenship as per T.H. Marshall and others. Now, in terms of international standards and norms, social and economic rights are found, as I mentioned, in that International Covenant on Social, Political, and Cultural Rights. That covenant prescribes the right of people to a freely chosen job, equitable and equal wages for work of equal value, dignified working conditions for workers and their families, professional training, equal opportunities for promotion, protection for families, especially for children, maternity protection, protection of boys, girls, and teenagers against economic exploitation. Social and economic rights also are found in conventions and declarations promoted by the International Labor Organization, notably the 4 core labor standards represented by 8 conventions, which call for freedom of association and the prohibition of child labor, forced labor, and discrimination in employment. Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room have heard of the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights? Okay, it's about 5 people. That's wonderful. Okay. And how many people in this room are familiar with the International Labor Organization agreements and conventions? Wow. 1, 2. Okay. All right. Well, okay. This is why I'm here, I suppose. But I'll tell you something else about this. These civil, political, and social economic rights are present in a varying weight and hierarchy across the globe. That is to say that in the United States, for example, it is no accident that few of you know about social and economic rights, and that is because social and economic rights and the relevant international conventions are considered to be like the stepchild of the panoply of rights. Because in the United States, what are mainly emphasized here? Civil and political rights. Less so social and economic, which also helps us to understand why there has been such a debate around the health care bill. In the former communist world, the social and economic rights were emphasized, but civil and political tended to be de-emphasized. In the Nordic countries, I would say that all 3 sets of rights tend to be equally emphasized and reflected in constitutions, various legal frameworks, social policies, and so on. Okay, now, women's economic citizenship and social rights are defined in those conventions that I just mentioned, but also specifically in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, in the Beijing Platform for Action, and the Charter of Women Workers' Rights of what used to be called the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, which is now known as the International Trade Union Confederation. They are also inscribed in the ILO, International Labor Organization, conventions pertaining to maternity protection, non-discrimination, and equal remuneration. Many countries have adopted these standards and inscribed them in national laws. The countries of the Middle East and North Africa have adopted those standards too, but some key conventions remain unratified. So, for example, and I'm sorry that the print there is so small, but this table and the one right after that, which focuses on the oil-rich Gulf countries, this table shows a sample of countries of the Middle East and North Africa and some of these major international conventions having to do with social and economic rights. Two key conventions have not been ratified by those countries. Ilo Convention 183 on maternity protection, which was supposedly adopted in the year 2000, and also Ilo Convention 156, which is one of the newer ones, and this one is workers workers with family responsibilities, 1981. There's another one that I'll talk about in one moment. These two conventions are very important. Now, Middle East countries tend to sign on to international agreements, but it's telling that they have not signed on to those two. And it's important that they do so if, in fact, they will implement national legislation and national institutions and mechanisms to enhance women's economic participation. For the oil-rich Gulf countries, they have signed on to certain of these conventions, but again, they have not signed on to the ILO Convention on Workers with Family Responsibilities, nor the one on maternity protection, nor the most recent ILO Convention on Protection of Domestic Workers. Why did I include that there? Because the oil-rich Gulf countries are the ones in the region that tend to have the largest proportion, actually, of domestic workers, and in particular, migrant domestic workers. So two key international conventions which would support the social rights of migrant working women or domestic working women are the two that the countries have chosen not to sign on to. So this is also an obligation on their part which they need to, I think, address sooner rather than later. So when we talk about social rights for women's economic citizenship in the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere, what exactly do we mean? So here I have a listing of what social rights for women would look like or do look like in some parts of the world. Across the globe, women's social rights are variable. They may enjoy rights to paid maternity leave, creches or nurseries, at the workplace with nursing breaks to feed their babies. Believe it or not, that does exist in a number of countries. Subsidized child care facilities in the community, and retirement that is several years earlier than that of men. And that is to compensate for the double burden. Women also may be the beneficiaries of laws against discrimination in employment and pay and against sexual harassment. Other social economic rights for working women include vocational training, skills upgrading, and opportunities for advancement, and prohibition of discrimination and sexual harassment. Indeed, in the Middle East and North Africa, major campaigns have been launched by women's rights groups against sexual harassment, and in some cases, governments have passed laws in recognition of a working woman's right to a healthy and dignified work environment free of sexual harassment. Such campaigns and legal initiatives have been especially successful in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. As I mentioned, Morocco and Tunisia tend to have the largest number of women in the labor force, so they have been pushing, but also the trade unions in those countries have been pushing. Algeria, too, has a trade union, a big trade union, which is actually surprisingly very supportive of working women's rights. Algeria today also has the largest proportion of women in parliament in the Middle East, North Africa region, and one of the highest proportions in the world, 31%. In Egypt, women's rights groups have also been working for quite a number of years to try to get the authorities to address this perennial, persistent problem of sexual harassment and abuse of women, with less success than has been the case in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Now, care work for children or for senior relatives is typically carried out by women, whether within the family or by paid outside help. Institutional supports to ease the burden of care, family or child allowances for lower income women, and legal protection for domestic workers, these are part of the panoply of women's social rights. And a few words about, in addition to care work in general, about children. The failure to treat children as a public good by failing to provide mothers with paid maternity leaves, with quality and affordable child care, family allowances, preschool, good public schooling, and so on. These are underinvestments in the family that could stall societal progress. And as we know in the United States, the absence of such supports, including preschool for all children, good public schools, family allowances, and so on, I think have exacerbated social problems in this country. So arguments for what, for example, Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen have called human capabilities, or what Joan Tronto has called an ethic of care, or other feminists have referred to as gender justice. These arguments constitute an appeal for a world where the daily caring of people for each other is a valued premise of human existence, and for the establishment of institutions to reflect that value. In other words, there is a case to be made for, an efficiency case to be made for social rights, a citizenship rights case to be made for social rights, but also an ethical argument to be made for social rights. And a related argument is that women require institutional supports for work-family balance in order to attain full citizenship. In the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, such supports are needed to attract more women to the labor force, to recognize their social contributions, and to create a level playing field between male and female workers. So, finally, scholars have identified 5 categories of households with different earner-carer arrangements that have been supported by, or should be supported by, the state, the market, or family relations. And these are, as noted on the table, first, male breadwinner, female carer, male breadwinner, female part-time earner, dual earner, state carer, dual earner, marketized carer, and dual earner, dual carer. In the Middle East, North Africa region, where the social category of dual earner is not yet widespread, and where gender relations do not yet reflect the dual carer model, the male breadwinner, female homemaker model is the most prevalent, as I've mentioned earlier. Still, many lower-income households in which the wife or mother is involved in informal labor may be identified as falling into the male breadwinner, female part-time earner category. And for the oil-rich Gulf countries, and to a lesser extent Jordan and Lebanon, with their prevalence of domestic help drawn from migrant labor, another category might be introduced, male breadwinner, marketized carer. Now, if you look at these categories, and if they were arrayed on a continuum, they would represent the range of gender relations from traditional to egalitarian. Most traditional being male breadwinner, female carer, and most egalitarian being dual earner, dual carer. So what I've done here then is to suggest different sets of social policies, of institutions, of mechanisms that are needed to support these different categories of family relations. So they either exist or they should exist. And these are support mechanisms from the market or support mechanisms from the state. So for example, obviously where you have the male breadwinner, female carer model, You would have employer-provided Social Security extended to the wife and the mother, and not just to the breadwinner, and also family allowances, tax credit, and so on. So these are some of the more policy-oriented suggestions that I've included here. So, finally, what conclusions can we draw from this discussion? Going back to my discussion of globalization at the onset of my talk, the era of globalization has eroded many of the social rights that existed across countries to some extent in the 50s, 60s, 70s. In recent years, however, calls for the strengthening of social rights by social movements, by advocacy groups, and certain international organizations have become more noticeable. Such calls are made in the name of ethics, in the name of gender justice, and in the name of economic stability and better functioning of labor markets. Social provisioning, whether through the market or the state, should support the viability of households and families, and should support the capacity of women to seek employment, to stay in the labor force, and to enjoy family life. And social provisioning should also support the rights of citizen workers and migrant workers alike. Shorter working days for parents of small children. How's that for an idea? Which, by the way, exists in Sweden. Wouldn't that be nice if we had it here? Paid maternity leave of at least 6 months in duration, with additional leave for fathers, would be policies to recognize care work as a social good, a way to ensure parent-child bonding, a means to enable women's labor force attachment, and a pathway to gender equality. These are very important in the Middle East and North Africa region too, because the paid maternity leaves that are in existence there are actually of short duration. Parental leaves could be financed through a combination of government, employee, and worker contributions. Care for the elderly, who in the future will become a growing proportion of the population of some Middle Eastern countries, as is the case in many Western countries and Japan, should be compensated through family allowances or the provision of subsidized home care through social insurance. At the same time, the ethics of care, as well as the requirements of gender justice, call for the extension of labor rights, social insurance, and dignity for domestic workers to provide care for children, the elderly, and private households. So the case for women's social rights and economic citizenship is a case for better functioning labor markets, better economic performance and growth, and also for gender equality and women's rights. Thank you.
My name is Sujata Moti, and I think some of you know me. I'm the director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program here. And it's my honor to be the moderator for this session. And I want to thank Dr. Moghadam for laying out so elegantly the structural, institutional, and social conditions that permit, that facilitate, or constrain women's participation in the workforce. And rather than exercise my right as a moderator to ask the first question, what I'd like to do is open up the Q&A session to the floor, and perhaps I'll come back to my questions, which I have a couple of them coming from your tables. Sure. Do I pass the microphone around? No. Okay.
Hi, I'm Rabia. I'm a sophomore here at Middlebury. Can you talk a little bit more about your work at UNESCO?
Shall I respond to that, or shall we take? Yes. At UNESCO, I was chief of section within the social and human sciences sector. Are people familiar here with the way UNESCO is organized? It consists of 5 sectors: education, culture, communication, natural sciences, and social and human sciences. And I was in the social and human sciences sector, leading policy-oriented research and advocacy in the section on gender equality and development, which was part of the human rights department there. One of the things I'm very proud of in terms of my work at UNESCO was to help establish the Women's Research and Documentation Center, Palestinian Women's Research and Documentation Center in Ramallah in the West Bank. And we built that center and started some research projects on women's poverty and also on work and on political participation. And that was a very rewarding experience.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Armanios. I teach Middle East history here. Thank you so much for a great talk. I had 2 short questions, if I may. I was wondering about the differentiation between formal and informal labor. It seems to me that a lot more women might be actually involved in the labor force in MENA than we are able to account for by the statistics. So if you can speak a bit about that. Also, I'm struggling a little bit with the idea of, quote, Muslim family law as being a factor in, or at least being kind of taken as a holistic narrative, since if you were to look at Egypt, and if we're going to include Turkey, they don't even have Muslim law, and Iran, they all have just very different interpretations, Gulf countries, MENA, and so on. So if you can also problematize that for us as well, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's not just MENA, it's other regions in the world economy where we see a lot of women involved in informal labor. We also see a lot of men involved in informal labor. In fact, the few studies that we have in the Middle East and North Africa on informal labor actually suggest that, unlike Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, relatively fewer women are involved in the informal sector than are men. So the informal sector tends to be as male-dominated as the formal sector in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, these 2 sectors, formal and informal, are very important for research and also for advocacy. But I happen to be of the opinion that it is really women's involvement in formal sector labor, in the paid labor force, which is an adequate, a more pertinent measure of empowerment and of equality and of economic citizenship. Why is that the case? Because, for one thing, most of the benefits, the social policies, the laws, really pertain to workers in the formal sector in most parts of the world. Whether we are talking about regular wages, paid vacations, paid maternity leave, pensions, and so on, that's mainly in the formal sector. Now, in recent years, there has been, of course, discussion of trying to extend these rights, these entitlements, and so on, to workers in the informal sector. Part of what that means is to formalize the informal sector. But part of it also means, for example, in the case of SEWA in India, it's to organize workers in the informal sector and to bring them under the umbrella of a new institution and organization, which in a sense formalizes them too, and then forces some of the bigger organizations and agencies and ministries in the country to acknowledge this. So that's, it's true that many women work in the informal sector. It's truer for more regions than it is evidently the case in Middle East and North Africa. according to the available literature. We know that they are involved in unpaid labor in the MENA region, but it is truly the formal sector where women are underrepresented, and they are underrepresented also in terms of these social rights and economic citizenship, the whole array, from regular wages and benefits under their own control to pensions and retirement. On Muslim family law, you are absolutely right that different countries have different provisions within Muslim family law. There are some commonalities, though, among across the countries. Some commonalities also across the different Islamic schools of jurisprudence. One big difference is between Sunni and Shia in terms of what a widow might inherit, for example. But in general, across the Sunni schools, there tends to be more similarities than differences. And the differences that have occurred in recent years are the result of reforms that have been enacted by governments as a result of either international or domestic calls for change. So yes, Turkey did not have Muslim family law since the beginning of the Republic, but it had a very conservative civil code. Iran doesn't have a distinct set of legislation called family law, unlike, for example, North Africa and some of the other countries, but it has these provisions within its civil law, which are extremely patriarchal and based on Shia interpretation of the Sharia. Some of the other commonalities had to do with the fact that women cannot travel, etc., without permission of husband. But in some cases, that has changed in recent years as a result of the demands of the women's movement. And then, of course, a very significant change in Muslim family law came about in Morocco in recent years, about 10 years ago, where, again, after a 12-year campaign on the part of the women's rights organizations, the king, the parliament, and so on agreed to completely transform what was one of the most patriarchal family laws in the region into what is now probably the most egalitarian after that of Tunisia and maybe Turkey, although Turkey has no basis in Sharia. So yes, absolutely there are differences and changes, but those differences and changes have less to do with, as I have read it, with jurisprudence, and more to do with the reforms in more recent years as a result of social movements and especially feminist movements.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Marjila and I'm a junior. I would like to hear more about what is included in family law, and also when you refer to Sharia law, what is sort of like, what are they taken from Sharia law? Thank you.
Boy, I think that's a topic for a different discussion, because it's a very complex and very lengthy one. And I don't think I could do justice to it in a minute. But Muslim family law was adopted by modern states during the period of modernization and state building. And of course, various Muslim majority states adopted laws based on one or the other of the Sunni schools of jurisprudence. Of course, Iran adopted the Shia-based family. Now, it is claimed that Muslim family law is derived from Sharia. Now, that in itself is an object of and a subject of much debate, which is why I also say that it is difficult to discuss Sharia in particular in 1 minute. So simply to say that the claim is made that family law derives from Sharia, but there are different interpretations of Sharia, And of course, family law has been adopted by different countries with certain commonalities having to do with, for example, the privileges that men in the family have versus the obligations that women have. Of course, men have obligations too, to maintain their families, for example. That is an obligation on women. But women also have to obey their husbands. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not peculiar. You see, what is very interesting about, and this is where the debate on, what is Sharia, what is Islamic, what is universal, what is patriarchy. This is part of a big discussion. Women in the United States and in England. In England, when a woman married, her body and her property were transferred to her husband. If you're interested in the transformation of family law in the Western world, I highly recommend that you read Marianne Glendon, professor at Harvard University, legal scholar, professor of law, whose doctoral dissertation and subsequent 2 books, I believe, were precisely on this topic, the transformation of family law from patriarchal to egalitarian in Western Europe and in the United States. The similarities with the Muslim majority world are incredible, really quite amazing. Okay.
Faiza, here in the front row, please.
I know we've been talking a lot about family law, and I was just wondering how you think we can advance the place of women in society and the workforce without trampling over the culture of the family law in the Middle East.
That's also a good question. But I would change the phrasing to not we, but how are women in the Middle East and North Africa themselves addressing the place of family law in the culture and the politics and the legal frameworks of their countries? And how are they trying to maintain a balance between respect for their cultural and religious traditions and, of course, the imperatives and the need for women's equality, empowerment, and rights? And they're doing it. They're precisely doing that. So I have a paper, in fact, that came out in a sociology journal called Moghadam in 2010, where I have compared myself and a colleague. We compared the campaigns for family law reform in Morocco and Iran. And the question was, why did it succeed in Morocco and not in Iran? And the whole article is about what they did, their discourses, their frames, their strategies, their modes of collective action. So I think it's very important not to say what can we do, but really what are they doing? And they are doing a lot. In the 3rd edition of my first book, called Modernizing Women, Gender and Social Change in the Middle East, the 3rd edition just came out last month. The last chapter actually has, again, a listing of the legal and policy changes and reforms that have occurred in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa since 2006 as a result of this advocacy and collective action by women's rights organizations, and in part by their engagement with governments, their ability to have these elite allies within the state, within government, and then their capacity to enact these changes. So there is a lot happening there, in fact. It's a very dynamic region, extraordinarily dynamic. I mean, if you look at, for example, in Tunisia, during this constitutional reform process, so Tunisia, a leader of the Arab Spring, and one of the more stable examples of the Arab Spring. They have very good protocols and very good procedures. They now have this constitutional process in which representatives of the different political parties are actually in the Constituent Assembly, and they have been trying to draft a new constitution. One of the big controversies of last year was the wording over men and women. So are men and women equal, or are men and women complementary? Now, the Islamic community is not the only religious community, by the way, that prefers the word complementarity of men and women. I think perhaps the Pope might prefer that as well, maybe, or certain popes. But we had that debate in Tunisia, and the women's rights advocates, the feminist organizations, and their allies within the Constituent Assembly demanded the retention of the previous wording, which was men and women are equal, and they won. So it's a very dynamic region in which women's rights organizations are making these demands for civil, political, and social rights of citizenship. And they're gaining a lot of ground.
Thank you for the great talk. My name is Nana, and I'm also a junior here at Middlebury. I have one clarification and one question. So the clarification is about, so the model that you presented, it assumes that there are already a high percentage of highly educated women in these countries who are not being employed in the formal sector. And because I don't know what's the education level of women in these countries. So is it like there are women who are educated but they're not getting economic citizenship? So that's the clarification I want to ask. And my question is that since we're talking about rights here, can political enrollment or political, we saw that, as you mentioned, Arab Spring. So is political involvement of women in the political movement can be projected to women empowerment, which can lead to sort of getting women to voice their opinions and say we want to work as well? And also another thing I'm interested to know is what's the future of women employment in the oil countries where the oil level is diminishing now? I mean, we don't know. Yeah.
Right. Three excellent questions. About educated women, the good news about the region is that there are now more women in university than men. Women have surpassed female enrollments at the university level have surpassed the enrollments of men in most of the countries of the region. This is a global trend, by the way, but it has also extended to the Middle East and North Africa. So Iran, Morocco, Tunisia, Kuwait, I mean, all of those countries, there are more women than men. In almost all of them, with the exception of like 2 or 3, there are more women than men in the region. What does this mean? This means that in the future there will be even more demands on the part of these educated women for more rights, for economic participation, for political participation, and so on. At the moment, however, a disproportionately large number and high percentage of educated women are unemployed, seeking jobs. Disproportionate, much higher than male employment. The Middle East and North Africa region has very high rates of unemployment, and we've known this since the early 1990s. It was a function of that shift from in political economy from state-led to a more neoliberal type of economic system with privatization and so on. That generated a lot of unemployment actually. So male unemployment is high too, but female unemployment can be 2 or 3 times as high as male unemployment. The rate relative to the size of the labor force. Okay, so in some places you will see rates like 30% female unemployment. These are educated women looking for jobs, and they're not getting them. That is a function, obviously, of some structural economic difficulties and problems, but it's also probably a function of gender bias. So you have these educated women who are looking for jobs, but they're not getting them for both sets of reasons. That is the. But we still have this problem of working class and lower income women not being able really to access the formal labor force in particular. Factory work tends to be predominantly male in most parts of the world. We have not seen those proportions that are characteristic of those high proportions of women factory workers that are characteristic of East Asia, of some countries in Latin America, and so on. Only in Tunisia and Morocco have we seen relatively larger numbers of women in manufacturing. But that's only in those countries, to a lesser extent Egypt. So that remains a problem of working class and lower income women being able to access decent jobs, decent work. And meanwhile, you have educated women who are unemployed. So, it's a very serious economic problem. That's why so many people in the Middle East are so unhappy. This is why we had the Arab Spring, too. The Arab Spring was not only about civil and political rights, it was also about social and economic rights. People want decent health care. They want jobs. They want decent housing. There's a wonderful video from Morocco. Now, Morocco did not have a change of government, but it had its own version of the Arab Spring. And there's a wonderful video, you can find it on the YouTube, where their protest movement was called the 20 février. This was the Mouvement 20 février, the 20th of February movement. And all these young people, and also some older people too, were joining this movement. And if you go on YouTube and you see what are their grievances, what are their demands? Jobs, health care, proper housing, and so on. It's really this panoply of social and economic rights. And it's the same in Egypt. And today, why are people so angry why is the main trade union in Tunisia so angry with the Islamist-dominated government? Because it's useless in terms of fixing those economic problems. So these are very, very important socioeconomic issues and problems there. And this is why there are these calls for social and economic rights there, too.
I think she had a question about diminishing oil resources.
Oh, yes. And then women in politics as well. We always have the expectation, this is our feminist assumption, isn't it? That we want more women in parliament, in political power, not only for equity issues, but also our assumption is that they make a difference. And actually, the research for Scandinavian countries does suggest that the women in parliament there, whether they're from the conservative parties or from the social democratic or left-wing parties, they tend to agree on things like no war, no militarism, and more social spending. Now, is that a function of having all those women in parliament there, or is it a function of the general social democratic political culture of Scandinavia? That hasn't been determined yet. We need to have that kind of research for the United States. The research thus far suggests that women, Republican women and Democratic women might agree on reproductive rights for women, but not necessarily on other issues. But we need more research on that. In the Middle East and North Africa, again, there tends to be this same assumption that we are going to vote for you, but you have got to push the women's rights agenda in parliament. This was very explicit in the Iranian case, actually, with the reformist parliament, the sixth parliament, I think it was, during the Khatami period, where you had this group of 13 women members of parliament, and they formed a caucus, and their caucus was really about women's rights. It was really quite interesting in that respect. I'm interested to see what the women, this 31% women in Algeria will be focusing on. I'm really curious about that. We have the highest proportion of women in politics in the world today is in Rwanda. So for several years now, they have surpassed that consistently high proportion of women in politics in Sweden and Norway and Finland and so on. I'm not sure they've made a difference. So in terms of equity, it's great to have 56% of the parliament being women. But have these women in parliament in Rwanda been able to, for example, change the course of Mr. Kagame's foreign policy? For example, his meddling in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? I'm not sure. But in any event, we still assume that more women in politics in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa will make a difference. It'll obviously make a difference to gender equality, but it might also make a difference in terms of government priorities, foreign policy, and so on. And finally, oil. I would say that oil is making less of a difference in terms of female labor force participation than it has in the past, because these economies have been diversifying. The only real oil economies that we have right now are in the Gulf. I mean, Iran used to be, we would say that it was an oil, but it's not anymore. I mean, it's much more diversified. Algeria, too. I mean, still, a lot of the foreign exchange comes from oil in these countries, but, they have more diversified sectors. Yeah, and they're all worried about the fact that oil is now diminishing as a natural resource and as a source of revenue. So they've got to work pretty hard to create a knowledge, economy and some other types of sectors as well.
Okay. Let's have a couple of the students and then you, Faiza.
Okay.
Hi, Matti from Finland. You mentioned that in the Nordic countries, yes, there's a lot of push for civil, political, social rights, and you said that it would be important to treat children as public goods, also in the Middle East. But even in Finland and in all these other countries, there's a huge debate now saying, oh, like there's too much benefits for mothers, there's too much benefit for fathers, we should like reduce all these things because this is making us less competitive, this is bad, and there's huge social tensions because of this. So since these things already exist in countries where, female equality is very good, how can we, like what kind of arguments would we use in, the Arab world or other Muslim countries to justify that we need, to treat children as public goods and like put investment, like what arguments are there if there's so much negativity in the Nordic countries already on it?
I guess I would disagree with you about the negativity in the Nordic countries. I mean, they have reached a certain level of prosperity as well as social and gender equality that I think is unsurpassed in any other world region. Now, if there are debates right now about, for example, violence against women or something else, I know less about that. I mean, I'm not a specialist on Scandinavia, but all of the social and gender indicators suggest that that part of the world is really, I mean, if you look at all these international data sets, the Scandinavian countries are always on top. They're always number one in human development, in women's rights, etc. Economically, they've done very well. Okay, Nokia has just had to sell itself to Microsoft, but we simply do not see poverty in those countries the way we see poverty in some of the more unequal of the rich countries, like the US and the UK. It just doesn't exist there. So I think that's also a topic for a longer, for a different discussion. I mean, I think one would have to have a deeper and a more extensive discussion of what some of the problems are in Scandinavia today, what are people saying about that, and so on. But I think they remain a good model for us.
I probably phrased myself badly, but I wanted to ask, like, how would you justify the need for these policies to people in the Arab world? Like, what arguments would you use that, hey, you need to give maternal benefits? Like, would it just be, oh, this is better for poverty alleviation, or like, what would be your focus? How would you approach it? What would be the discourse there?
Both poverty alleviation. As I was saying at the beginning of the talk, the Millennium Development Goals are all about addressing poverty. Right. Okay. We have these impoverished populations in certain parts of the world, and we have to eradicate poverty. But let's also prevent poverty. Let's prevent poverty, as well as alleviate it, by providing citizens with a certain, let me see, what is it called in America? A safety net, a social safety net. But in other countries, these are called social rights, that you are a citizen of a country and you are entitled to these rights. And the government and the state, they take your taxes in order to give them back to you in the form of these rights, which enable you to live a dignified and decent life, and also to contribute to economic performance and to economic growth. So the arguments are justice and ethical arguments. The arguments are human capabilities, in these kind of philosophical approaches. The arguments are gender justice and gender equality. I mean, because women are uniquely responsible for care of children, care of elders. I mean, I'm experiencing that myself, not my brother. We need the institutional supports to be able to have that level playing field between men and women in the workforce. Without these kinds of institutional supports, women will continue either to be a smaller proportion of the labor force, as in the Middle East, or they will continue to have lower wages. And the income gap between men and women will continue to be wide, even in the most advanced countries, even in the countries where you have high female labor force participation. Because without those institutional supports that enable women to balance family responsibilities, the care that they provide in their families, and work and advancement and promotion and so on, the wage gap is going to continue to be a problem. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Professor. This is Helen. I'm a sophomore here. So we've been talking a lot about the world. I want to ask two questions that's more local. So is there paid maternity leave in Northwestern University where you work?
As you know, the United States is I think it's the only advanced industrialized country without a federal policy, a national policy on paid maternity leave. Which means that it is up to different employers to work it out with their employees. And universities also, generally speaking, they will abide with the Clinton Family Leave Act of, what was that, 1997?
Yeah. Family medical.
Or go beyond that. So again, if you have a nice discussion with your dean, you might be able to take a semester as well as a summer off.
But do you think legalization is worth promoting in universities and colleges? This is also a question for our president.
Just so you know, we have actually really generous parental leave policy at Middlebury. So I think it's a moot question in some ways in this particular locality. So
there is, just to mention this, that at a university institutional level, there's a program that the NSF funds called Advance, and this is really a program to promote and enhance women faculty members, mainly in the STEM disciplines, in sciences, mathematics, engineering. And one of the issues, of course, with women in those especially rigorous fields has to do with, paid maternity leave, family leave, and then, of course, for those of us who are somewhat older, the elder care issue becomes, pertinent as well. So, across the United States, I think the institutions are struggling with this. They're trying to address this issue, and sometimes it's being done around this initiative, this program called Advance.
I think we're running out of time, so I'm actually, and we've kept you talking for an enormously long time, but I'm going to allow Faiza to exercise her privilege for running around with the microphone. She gets to ask the last question.
Simple question. And we know that the research shows if women are part of the labor force, the economy gonna improve. And it's a very basic argument. But I don't understand why a lot of these countries or a lot of these governments in Middle East and North Africa, why they didn't do that? Is it that the cost of including women gonna overweight the cost of the benefits that they're gonna receive? Or what are other obstacles? I understand the cultural and religious obstacles, but I'm sure there are ways that they can be adopted locally and they can do that if they want to. But why they don't want to do that?
I really think it was the oil economy. I think it was really the revenues from oil which served to suppress female supply and demand. I mean, they didn't need women to work. They had all these revenues at their disposal for all these development projects, for infrastructural development. You know, Iran, all these petrodollars all over the place. Now, it's becoming less pertinent today. And meanwhile, the governments are, I think, a little smarter than they were before, but they are also responding to these calls on the part of civil society organizations and also these arguments made by international organizations about the relationship between female labor force participation, female economic participation, and household poverty, and household well-being, and good functioning of labor markets and economic growth. I mean, the evidence is so clear that China, for example, the world's factory, where would China be without female labor? Where would a lot of these countries, like the maquiladoras along the Mexico-U.S. border, where would they be without female labor? Where would Jamaica, where would a lot of the Latin American countries be without female labor? Philippines, Thailand, Sri Lanka, all of these countries. So the evidence is there. It's absolutely clear. Labor economists and everybody else has made that argument. In the Middle East and North Africa, it was the oil economy that really, really suppressed female. And I've been saying that for, since the early 90s. But these days, it is more of an argument and a discussion and a debate than it was 20, 30 years ago, precisely because the oil economy does not play the role that it did back then. I mean, we had a fairly integrated regional oil economy. Even those countries that were not oil-based benefited from the oil economy. How did they do that? Through labor migration, through remittances. They sent, the Jordanian workers or the Lebanese workers or the Tunisian workers who went to Libya or to Iraq or, to Kuwait. They sent money back to their communities and to their families. That also attenuated the need for their, the women in their families to work. And these were good wages. In fact, an economist, Masoud Karshanas, to whom I happen to be married, did a very interesting comparative analysis of the wages in manufacturing, comparing Middle East and North Africa to Latin America to East Asia. They were consistently higher in Middle East and North Africa. You're not convinced?
Well, I think we will stop with that question. And I guess if there's any silver lining to the decline in the oil economy, it's probably this, that maybe there'll be more women's equality in the Middle East. So,
as we say, inshallah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for a really stimulating conversation.